I want to start by saying welcome to everyone and thanks for joining us. I'm Rachel Robinson, Vice President of Mass Medic, and we are absolutely thrilled to be partnering with our member MPR on this excellent webinar. Katie and Jeff will give you a little bit of instruction on how to send questions in and whatnot, but I'm really excited that you all are joining us, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Katie.
Great, thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for joining this morning for our webinar on Systems Perspective on Usability Engineering. As Rachel mentioned, we're happy to take questions. We'll hold those until the end of the presentation, but if you have any that come up throughout the presentation, please just use the chat function in Zoom to send a message to everyone, and we'll go through and address any questions that come up. We'll leave plenty of time at the end to discuss those. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who might not be familiar with MPR, we are a diverse engineering services company. In the health and life sciences area, we offer a fully integrated product development and engineering services for medical device development. My role within MPR is to lead teams as project manager or system lead engineer for new medical device programs. I also lead MPR's Systems Center of Excellence, which means that I focus on developing systems engineering processes, risk management, and of course, usability and human factors processes for medical device development. I've had experience planning and executing all aspects of the usability engineering process, including detailed risk and task analysis, as well as planning and executing formative and human factors or summative validations. And at times I've also worked embedded in our clients' teams to help plan usability engineering activities, set up usability engineering programs, and really help plan and execute all aspects of the usability engineering process. So I'm looking forward to talking about my systems engineering perspective on usability engineering today. I thought to get started, I'll just give you a brief background on usability engineering process. I know a lot of the folks that are joining might already have some understanding of the high-level process, but for those that might not be familiar, we'll just quickly go through a refresher on the usability engineering process. The usability engineering process is just that, it's a process. It's applied iteratively throughout development. It is complementary and integrated with our design control and risk management processes for medical device development, and of course complies with industry standards and guidance. The main standard that defines the usability engineering process is IEC 62366 Part 1. That defines the elements of the usability engineering process and is complementary to FDA guidance, which provides additional guidance on applying human factors and usability engineering to medical devices. So those are really the top two standards or guidance that are used in application of the usability engineering process, although there's a lot of other guidance out there that is also helpful. And I'll mention also just briefly the IEC 60601 Part 6 collateral standard on usability. That really just creates a bridge between the 60601 series for basic safety and essential performance of medical electrical equipment. It's essentially a pointer or bridge for how you can use IEC 62366 to comply with those medical electrical requirements. The basics from a high-level view start early in user research and planning by defining the use specification for the device, understanding the users, the use environment, and conditions of use for a device. That leads into task and risk analysis, where we define user interactions and start to evaluate hazard-related use scenarios and use-related risks through application of the risk management process. A key part of that is to start to identify risk control measures that can be used to mitigate use-related risks that can help feed into the requirements and drive the user interface design of the product. Throughout the design process, the design is evaluated through iterative formative evaluations that we can use to evaluate usability and the effectiveness of risk controls through those iterative evaluations throughout development. At the end of the design and formative evaluation process, when we have a final production equivalent design, that's where the human factors validation comes in, which is sometimes also referred to as the summative validation, where really the focus is to demonstrate use safety and effectiveness on the final user interface design. That will allow us to conclude whether the use-related risk is acceptable. If it is, then we're ready for launch. If not, then we might need further iteration through the usability engineering process to further reduce use-related risk. I think the key takeaway here is that it is a process that is integrated through all stages of development. It is not just a single human factors validation that's completed at the end of development. It's important to think about how to integrate this throughout our development process. Along the side here, I've just included some examples of the tools that we can use along the way throughout this process. Early on when we're defining the use specification in the user research phase, we can use tools like user interviews, surveys, focus groups. As we get into task and risk analysis, of course, we have our ISO 14971 risk management process and tools like failure modes and effects analysis and fault tree analysis. As you get into the design, there are a lot of different tools that you can use to mock up and simulate the design early on, wireframe simulators, prototypes, and a variety of different formative evaluation methods. A lot of times people might think about formative evaluations as just simulated use testing, putting a prototype in front of a user and creating use scenarios for them to test. But there are also other methods available to us in our usability toolkit, such as expert reviews or heuristic reviews against defined principles for human factors to evaluate the design. And then finally, in your human factors and usability validation, you're looking at actual or simulated use testing of really focusing in on your critical tasks. The critical tasks are those that are related to use safety that could cause serious harm if they're performed incorrectly or not at all. So that's a very quick and high-level view of the usability engineering process. We'll dig into some of the details later as we go through and talk about how we integrate that in with the systems engineering process. So shifting gears a bit, I'd like to talk about the systems engineering approach that we apply to development here at MPR. You might be familiar with the V model for systems engineering. The basic idea is to start at the top left of the V by first trying to understand and define stakeholder and user needs for the product. And then as we progress down the left-hand side of the V, that will drive the requirements, the technical requirements for the system. And that can be used to drive how we break down the system architecture and decompose the system into individual core elements of the system. The idea being that if we break down the system driven from user needs and requirements, we can focus on small chunks of the design to prove out key technical risks early, prove that the individual elements of the system work before starting to come up the right-hand side of the V where we integrate the system together, verify that the system meets the system level requirements, and then finally validate the user needs for the product. Again, the high level idea being coming down the left-hand side of the V, break the system down into manageable pieces to really focus on driving down individual technical risks early, and then prove those technical risks out before you start integrating and testing at the system level. Systems engineering also considers bringing together a lot of different disciplines that are all being designed at the same time. Of course, you have your top level program management, and at the end of development, verification and validation and integration, and a lot in between that all has to work together. We have hardware designers, we have software designers, we're developing instructions for use, training, and need to also integrate our important medical device processes like risk management and human factors usability in along the way. So it's important that someone within the team serve in the systems engineering function. At MPR, we do have a system lead engineer role within our overall product development team. This might be called something different in different organizations. It might be your lead engineer, your cognizant engineer, or it might be the program manager or project leader that's serving that systems engineering role. But really, the main point is that someone needs to provide technical leadership at all stages of this V model to make sure that how we break down the system addresses the user needs and stakeholder needs and requirements, and that we really are driving out the technical risk early in the project. So the system engineering role touches a lot of different areas of development. It can be integral to program planning and management. Really, the systems engineering role owns requirements development and management and how we decompose the system. And then also make sure that we're integrating risk management and that provides oversight for bringing all of the different subsystems together and V&V planning. The key here is that it's someone on the team who has the ability to influence project planning and direction across all disciplines to really use a systematic approach to drive out risk in the product. And the main objective of the systems engineer is to try to make the project successful. We all know that cost goes up as development progresses further and further along. And the further along you get in development, the harder it is to make changes and pivot to a different direction. So it's important to try to make sure that we don't extend the end date of a project unnecessarily, because eventually the product could be irrelevant or might not ever make it to market if we're not able to get there in a reasonable amount of time. So one of the systems engineer's roles is to really think about how do we drive out design risk early. In the ideal scenario, our risk profile looks something like this through the course of the project. In the early development phases, and particularly early in design and implementation, we want to drive down design risk as early as possible before we've spent a lot of time and money on development, and where we still have the flexibility to pivot and make changes throughout development. And the ideal case is, as you get towards the end of design and implementation, that we've really driven out most of that design risk, and through integration, verification, and validation, should be no surprises, smooth sailing as you get more towards the end of the product if we've done our job as a systems engineer. So what are the things that we're worried about that are these design risks that keep us up at night? The easiest or most obvious thing that systems engineers worry about is technical feasibility. Imagine that I'm designing a medical device that has a fluid handling system that has pumps and valves and some control scheme associated with it. As a systems engineer, I'm certainly going to want to break that into a subsystem, make sure that I prototype that on the benchtop, make sure that everything's working, that I can provide the control that I want to. That just comes naturally to systems engineers to try to tackle those tough technical feasibility challenges early on a project. And of course, it's always ingrained in us to think about safety as a key input to product design, always thinking about integrating risk management through the process along the way. But often risk is reduced too late for some of these other elements that can bring in a lot of design risk to the product, thinking about manufacturability, interoperability, security, and of course usability, which we know is also pretty closely related to safety as well. So by thinking about usability in a systems engineering approach, we can start to think about usability as another project level risk that really should be mitigated early in the development process. So let's talk a little bit more about that, how we can integrate usability into our systems engineering process. Going back to the V model for systems engineering, again, thinking about how we can define and decompose the system and then build it back up through integration and testing. The usability engineering process and the tools available to us are really quite complementary to that systems engineering approach. Thinking about starting where we're defining user needs for the system, some of the early tools that are used in user research can be quite complementary and also helpful to defining our user needs, as well as the use specification for the product. So tools like that are more generative methods like contextual inquiry, observing users in their actual use environment, or conducting user interviews or surveys. All of these can be really useful to understand who are the users, how they're going to use the product, what they really need out of the product. So are really useful to start early, both within our usability engineering process and to complement the overall systems engineering approach in defining user needs first. Then as we start to think about translating those user needs into system technical requirements, some of the usability engineering tools start to become quite useful in that as well. As we start to perform initial task and risk analysis, that can help identify certain risk control measures or features in the design that are needed as risk controls, and that can feed into the requirements and really ultimately influence our system architecture and how we might want to break apart different pieces of the user interface in the system. And then as we get into design and implementation, this is where a lot of our more evaluative tools like formative evaluations can be very useful as the user interface design progresses. Starting earlier in development of the design, things like expert reviews or heuristic analysis against known human factors principles can be useful to evaluate early iterations of the user interface. As you get further along in design and you start to have early prototypes of subsystems, you might do some early simulated use testing. And of course, throughout the process of design, we're always updating and iterating on task and risk analysis. As we start to come up the other side of the V and think about integration and verification and validation, that's where we can think about doing formative simulated use testing on the first integrated functional prototypes. And then ultimately in design validation, human factors validation is one piece of your overall validation. And many times you can actually design your human factors validation study to accomplish elements of design validation at the same time, validation of your user needs. Sometimes you can handle that in one overall study, and in some cases you can handle pieces of it in the HF validation and then pieces of it in a separate design validation study as well. So overall, the usability engineering process, if applied early, can dovetail quite nicely with the V model for systems engineering. So thinking about that, who owns the usability of the device within the overall program? We certainly have a lot of people who touch usability throughout the development process. Hardware designers might be designing physical interfaces like controls. Software or GUI designers are designing software user interfaces. We might have technical writers who are developing instructions for use or training materials, as well as a number of other people on the team who might ultimately touch usability of the device. So it really is a team effort. And my pitch is that the systems engineer already owns mitigating design risks, so that's a natural place for the systems engineer to consider usability as one of the design risks that should be incorporated into the overall plan for the program. But really, it might be different people in your organization, but the key is it should be someone who's going to own it from the beginning and have the influence to plan and integrate usability in with other project activities. I think the reasons for this, for ownership and influence, are evident in past experiences that I've had on programs. There are a lot of reasons that we can convince ourselves, although well-intended, that we shouldn't integrate usability early in the process. Things that you might have heard are things like, well, the user interface isn't ready to evaluate yet. I need more finished prototypes before I can start usability. Or we don't think that anyone's going to have any difficulty with the user interface. Or a big one is we start too late and it seems too late to change anything about the design. So it's important that whoever's owning the usability engineering process and driving down that risk has the influence to make sure that it is planned within the development program. So talking about that a little bit more, usability planning, I'd like to talk about how you can develop an overall usability strategy into your program that reduces the program risk. Again, thinking about usability as a risk that can be driven down early in the project, it's important to plan this into your overall development program and schedule. The actual strategy that you come up with for your device is going to be different for every device. It can be scaled based on the risk profile of the device, which is another reason it's really important early on in development to start to look at the use risks of your device to help inform the overall plan or strategy for how you're going to integrate usability. And it's important to have a clear vision for the types and evaluations and materials that you're going to need throughout development. That gives us the opportunity to plan the resources that we're going to need to support each of the evaluations along the way. It's important to think about resources, not just in terms of who's going to be recruiting users and moderating the studies, but also who's going to be needed to create the materials that we're going to evaluate in the study. And is that part of their development plan to develop those materials to support usability? So to illustrate the high-level strategy that might be developed, this is just an example of usability engineering activities that might be performed on a typical project. As I mentioned, it's going to vary from project to project. So you might have more or less activities depending on the particular device and the risk profile of the device. But it's important to have this overall vision for what usability engineering activities are going to be performed each step in the way and still apply the process throughout the entire development of the device. So I've broken this up into several different development phases. We use a phase development approach to drive out risk early. It starts with concept development in a phase 0. And then in feasibility phase, key subsystems are developed to drive down technical risk. Transitioning into phase 2 development, that's where we develop fully functional prototypes of the device. And then finally in phase 3, the pilot phase is where we produce pre-production prototypes, pilot systems for evaluation and complete verification and validation. So these are the top level development phases that are typical in any new medical device program within MPR. So looking at what might be typically performed during each phase of development, it starts at the concept phase. You might have some user research activities if it's needed for your product, really driving at trying to understand the use specification. Who are the users? What are their environments? What are the conditions of use? And that's documented in that use specification. In some cases, if you're developing a next generation product or a small design change from an existing product, that use specification might be already well known and you might not need to do very much research at all to understand that. In other cases, you might need to do more additional user research activities to fully understand the use specification and user needs for your product. So it really does need to be scaled based on your product, the risk, and the information that you have. All of that can be used to develop a high-level usability engineering plan for the program. That is this plan for this set of activities that will be completed within your strategy for the program. And then it's also typical in a phase 0 to start thinking about known use errors, completing adverse events searches, such as through the MAUDE database or information that you might have on similar devices, through post-market data. So we usually start trying to look at that as an input to the use risk analysis as well in phase 0. And then transitioning into phase 1, the feasibility phase, this is where in the overall product development process, the detailed subsystem design starts to take shape, including the user interface design. You might plan one or more formative studies on really specific pieces of the design that it's useful to evaluate early. This is also typically when we start to put together the task analysis and use risk analysis, defining how our users are going to interact with the device and the use-related risks associated with the device. That feeds into defining our requirements in a user interface specification for development of the user interface as a subsystem. And of course, any formative plans and reports that go along with the studies that we've planned. As we transition into phase 2 development, it's typical to have formative studies on the more integrated functional prototypes that are starting to come together. And then finally in phase 3, the pilot phase, That's when your human factors validation study would be performed and the associated report. There will also typically be a usability engineering report that's analogous to the risk management summary report that documents that we did everything we said we'd do in the usability engineering plan and summarizes the outputs of our usability engineering file. It might also be necessary to put together a more detailed human factors summary report if that is necessary to include as part of your FDA submission. There is a separate draft guidance document from the FDA that identifies a list of high priority devices for human factors review that lists out specific product codes and device types that there is an expectation that you include an HF summary report for. Although if your device has serious use-related risks, there might be additional device types that also require that as part of the submission. So this is an example of what an overall usability program might look like, but you might be wondering, well, how do I figure out what to do for me? We've talked about reducing usability risks early. What are some strategies that I can use when I'm planning my overall usability strategy for the program to really drive down that usability risk? I'd like to talk about a few recommendations that I have for planning to reduce that risk. The big one is to consider the usability risk mitigation early in system architecture planning. Complete your preliminary use risk analysis early in development and build in use-related risk controls into the system architecture or safety architecture of the system. You're likely familiar, many of you are likely familiar with the hierarchy of risk control measures that's defined by through our risk management process. Ideally, inherent safety by design first, then protective measures if we can't completely eliminate any risk, and then finally, least preferable is information for safety. So by thinking about use-related risk controls and how we can integrate them into hardware or the system design early on to really eliminate potential use errors, we can reduce the reliance on information for safety or training that might need to be validated at the end of development, and ideally eliminate any potential for use errors to lead to serious harms. Thinking about this early and really building in the usability risk mitigations into the system can help us have fewer of those critical tasks that we need to evaluate in validation, which means a simpler and lower risk validation at the end of development. Another approach to reduce risk is to think about shifting usability evaluation of critical hardware subsystems earlier in the process. Hardware is extremely difficult to change late in development. If you wait until all the way at the end of development when you've got a functional, fully integrated pre-production prototype, and then you find out, oh, the power switch is not in the right spot on the device, I need to move it where users can recognize and reach it. You know, that could be a major design overhaul that could impact electrical, mechanical, that could impact our EMC testing. So it's really important to get the usability input on any hardware subsystems early in the process. And if you wait until all the way at the end when you have a fully integrated system, it's likely too late to really make any changes to hardware. And then you're stuck in the trap of having to just use information for safety or training to try to mitigate usability difficulties in the product. So I would recommend leveraging early prototyping or visualization tools as much as possible for hardware subsystems early in the development process. There are many tools that we have at our disposal, renderings and sketches, storyboards, even VR is becoming popular now, foam mock-ups, 3D printed or painted models. This is an example of a full-scale foam mock-up of a device that we did a few years back. This was developed pretty early on in the process to help us lock down our disposable configuration, which had some pretty long lead times to finalize the design and manufacturing. So before we spent a lot of time laying out the hardware inside of the device, created this mock-up to try to understand different configurations and how the user might interact with it. And that really helped us drive the hardware interfaces that we put into the detailed design. Similarly, another approach to reduce risk is to evaluate your software user interfaces before you spend a lot of time on coding and implementation. There are a lot of tools out there for rapid prototyping of software. You can use something as simple as storyboards, paper versions of your user interface. You can create wireframes that show navigation and flow and walk users through that and see if it conceptually makes sense to them. And you can create a wide variety of different user interface simulators to simulate the user interface before you ever write any code for it. An example here is a device with a more complex user interface screen that has a lot of pieces of information that are being displayed. And in this case, this is a 3D printed model that has a tablet embedded behind it that allows us to very quickly evaluate and make changes to the user interface before we spend a lot of time on implementing the software code. Another approach is to try to shift our thinking to think about instructions for use and training as subsystems. Again, the theme here being driving evaluation earlier in design. The maybe traditional or historical way of thinking about instructions for use or training is that it's developed at the end once the design is fully finished and we're ready to launch the product. So an important way to reduce risk is to really shift that thinking to think about it as a subsystem like any other subsystem that needs to be prototyped, tested, and iterated on like any other subsystem. So we can start to think about developing instructions or portions of the instructions or training along with other subsystems as they come along in development. It is a little bit of chicken or egg because you do need enough about the design to write instructions, but if you keep it as a living document or output that can be iterated on, that can really save you a lot of time in the end, having to potentially redo studies if you have issues with your instructions or training. And in particular, you might focus on sections of the user interface or training to pilot information for safety that you're going to include. Another approach to reduce risk is to try to be a little bit strategic about how you sequence developing certain features. If we perform the use risk analysis early on and we know that there are certain features of the design that are going to be a high risk from a usability perspective, do we have any ability to prioritize development of those first and get it in front of users so that we can get some feedback and iterate on that more? And I say consider there because, of course, usability is not the only thing to consider. I mentioned all of those other design risks that the systems engineer is worrying about. So it needs to be considered and weighed along with the technical risks in deciding what to tackle first, but certainly should be a consideration. An example is, imagine that you're developing a sequence of user interface screens, and we know buried in the settings screen that there's a high use risk setting that a user might need to set. It might be natural to develop the settings screens at the end and some of the main screens first or some of the other submenu functions first, but maybe it makes sense to really focus on developing those high risk features and test them out first. Shifting a little bit into how to plan to make reduce risk to make our studies effective, it's important to plan ahead in the overall program for materials and control of the device. If you have a good plan for the different studies that you're going to perform at different stages in development, we can make sure that you incorporate the right build sizes into our prototype builds to account for usability samples. You certainly don't want to be taking away 2 of the development systems that the software engineers are using to get to feature complete right at the time when they're at a critical point in the project. So it's important to just think about that and plan ahead to make sure that you do have enough devices available for the studies. The other part of that is thinking about how you're going to execute the studies ahead of time, and are we going to need any particular system control to be able to execute those. As an example, imagine that you have a device that has a fluid system that needs to be set up and primed before you run a treatment. You plan to have users set up the disposable and run through the priming sequence during the use scenarios. Well, we certainly don't want users sitting there for 20 minutes waiting while the device primes. So we need a way to be able to either bring in a second device that's already primed, or maybe we have software control through a serial interface that we can skip ahead or shorten the priming sequence with a special software usability build. All of those are possible, but they take planning. So if I'm going to need a certain software build from the software developers, they need to know that's coming and give me the control that I need to run the usability study. So it's important to think through that and weigh the effort that's going to be needed for how we might be able to run the studies as well. Related to that, it's always a great idea to plan for a walkthrough and equipment checkout before each study. This can reduce risk of the study going awry. You certainly don't want to get into a study session and find out that the feature that you're trying to test has a bug or doesn't work as it's intended to. Often, in particular on early formative studies, we're running studies on in-progress hardware or software. So it's important to sort of take the system owners aside who are developing the system or prototypes that you're going to use in the study, and make sure they really understand what you're going to test. You don't want a situation where they say, oh, well, I didn't understand you were going to test that feature. That's not ready yet. Early planning and transparency and making sure that the various team members are working together can really help smooth over a lot of those issues that can derail your planned study. It's also a good idea at least about a week before the study to plan for time for functional checkout with those system owners to make sure everything's working as you expect it to work before the study. A week sounds like not a lot of time, but when you're getting prototypes ready just in time for usability studies, you know, a week is about as much margin as you might get. Similarly, especially for complex validation protocols with a lot of different use scenarios and steps, or that might have training integrated with them, it's a great idea to plan for a dry run study of the human factors validation before you execute the study. Dry run the protocol to just make sure it runs smoothly, allow you to refine the protocol to address flow and timing or reduce any test anomalies, maybe because someone just didn't understand your question, and reduce the risk of unexpected use problems during validation. This is really important. If you have use errors during your human factors validation, you will need to do a root cause analysis on why those happened, if they could lead to serious risk, and address why or why not the system is safe to use as is. If it is not, then you will need to circle back into the usability engineering process, and your validation at that point has become a formative study, and you may need to repeat either all or aspects of your human factors validation if you encounter use problems that could use to serious risks that aren't adequately mitigated. So planning for a dry run that maybe has a few users as a formative study just before your human factors validation can really help you a lot to reduce risk. An example that comes up a lot in human factors validations is around information for safety. As I mentioned earlier, you might wait until the very end to develop instructions for use, as well as any important warning notices or information for use. And then you certainly don't want to be in a human factors validation and find out that your users can't understand the warnings that you've given in your instructions for use. That's an easy fix that could be made by just trialing that on users prior to the validation. So those are all some strategies that when we think about the systems perspective on usability, of reducing usability risk early, can be used to really come up with and develop that overall strategy for usability for your individual program. Having this going into the program can help us plan and really reduce those risks early and reduce any surprises or unexpected use difficulties later in validation. So to just wrap up with a few final thoughts and leave some time for questions. Usability risk, when viewed from a systems perspective, can be viewed as a project level risk that can be driven down early in the process. It's a team effort to develop a system with adequate usability, but I do think it's important to have a clear owner with the ability to influence planning and integration of project activities. As I mentioned at MPR, that's the systems engineer, but anyone who has that ability to own it through the whole development process can serve that role. And through that systems engineering thinking, to really shift our thinking to view usability risks as just as important as technical risk, and something that should be thoughtfully driven out early in the process instead of just waiting to the end to do a human factors validation. And then finally, it's important to map out a strategic plan to help the team plan for success throughout the development process. So with that, if you do have any questions, please submit them through the chat tool, and my colleague Jeff here is going to help me sort through those questions and ask us a couple of follow-up questions. But
Sure.
While we're waiting for that, just want to also offer my contact information is shown up on the screen with my email. Please feel free, if you have any additional questions after the webinar, to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Let's tee it up. Jeff, do you have an initial question for me?
I do. Thanks, Katie. So a question from Craig Fryman says, do you have any sample size recommendations for numbers of users and number of devices to be tested for usability? So where do we get those sample sizes from?
Yeah, so it depends on the particular study that is being performed, and it can vary. The typical rule of thumb for formative evaluations is anywhere between 5 to 8 users for formative evaluations. But I would say that even for earlier formative evaluations, even fewer than that can really be effective as well, particularly if you're able to, if you have access to clinical advisors or clinical resources on your team. You might even be able to do really early formative evaluations using some of their help and really getting input early on to help guide the direction of development. And then when you shift to human factors validation, there is pretty clear guidance on that, both in the FDA guidance has some detailed information on that, the FDA guidance document that I mentioned at the beginning. It's the typical expectation is 15 users per user group for validation, but that's also based on risk. So you need to evaluate for your particular device what's the appropriate sample size to reduce the risk. But I would encourage you to take a look at that FDA guidance documents for some additional discussion on sample sizes and how many users can reduce a certain number of percentage of use problems. And an important note on sample size as well is that's per distinct user group. As part of your use specification, you'll define who are the users of the device. And we typically will divide those up into distinct user groups who might have different characteristics that influence use. So for example, there might be a physician user group and there might be a lay or patient user group, and the expectation is 15 of each group. It's also important to get that mix of different users in your early formatives as well.
Awesome, thanks, Katie. Another question is, how do you quantify the formative and summative studies data and findings?
Sorry, can you say that again?
How do you quantify the formative and summative data that you're getting from these studies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Early on in formative studies, it can be quite open-ended. Formative studies you really have a lot of flexibility to gather information about use safety, but also about user preferences as well. And you can ask a lot of open-ended subjective feedback as part of those sessions that can inform design as well, just as in terms of user preferences. In terms of things that are more quantitative, really we're looking at, especially when you shift towards HF validation at the end, you're looking at the number of use errors that occurred or close calls or use difficulties, and looking to look at each of those individual cases of use difficulties, and regardless of the quantity, address that through the risk management process. So it ends up being a combination of both qualitative and quantitative look at the results, and that can vary throughout the process.
Awesome, thanks, Katie. Another question. When can I have coworkers from the development team participate in usability studies?
Sure. Well, it's pretty clear that you may not have your coworkers participate in your final human factors validation. But again, you do have more flexibility early on in formative evaluations. It's always good to get user feedback. One of the sort of gray areas, again, is when you have clinician advisors who might be part of your company. They technically are part of your company, but can still provide really good early input into user interface design. So a little bit more flexibility, but generally as you get later towards the end of the development process, and certainly the human factors validation, you should not have employees of your company serving as users.
Good point. Awesome. Okay. So questions are, during COVID, how are we handling these kind of usability studies and different experiences? If people don't want to come into a facility for testing, how do we do this in a virtual kind of manner?
Sure, that's a hard question. I think we're all still figuring that out together, and I'm sure that will evolve over time. It is a lot easier to translate some of the earlier formative or user research types of techniques into virtual interactions through Zoom and video conference, but you're less able to do some of the visits in the actual use environments in all cases, or some of the later validation studies. So it's just something that has to be handled on a case-by-case basis, and I think we'll all keep learning together about how to effectively do that in this environment.
Awesome. Here's a question. Where do you feel the user experience research and motivational evaluation fits in the V model, especially given how many mHealth digital apps fall under the medical device umbrella? So what are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
The user experience research, how does that, in the motivational evaluation, how does that fit into the V model that you mentioned before?
Yeah, I think that thinking about the V model, I think that does fit in well with the thought process of formative evaluations along the way. User experience and whether a product delights users is, to me as a systems engineer, is very important, as well as the use safety aspect. And the usability engineering process is very focused on, and particularly the validation is very focused on use safety. But I think that any iterative methods you can do to get feedback on the user interface and user's experience early in development is a good idea.
Okay, awesome. Here's a question. Any thoughts on handling contrasting inputs from users, specifically clinicians? So how do you have competing inputs that might be at odds with each other? How do you handle that?
Sure, and that might come up a lot, again, in early formative evaluations where you have more open-ended feedback on the design. Everyone's got an opinion about what the design should be, certainly, and that's where trying to make sure that you have a good cross-section of users and their experiences and background to get diverse feedback from different perspectives can be useful. And you can take a high-level view of all of that subjective feedback together to inform the direction of the design. Later in human factors validation, it becomes a little bit more cut and dried. They commit a use error or have a use difficulty, or they don't. So there's really no competing information there. Users who represent the full range of your intended user profile all need to be able to use the device safely and effectively.
Awesome. So a question from Sean Robinson at Mayo Clinic. Are there vendors, hospitals, et cetera, have centers or access to users and ancillary equipment that will make usability assessment easier from a logistics standpoint? So what are the kind of sim labs and groups that we work with in order to do this type of study?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There are a number of groups and partnerships that make this go easier. For example, MedStar has a human factors usability engineering group here in DC that tries to bring industry together with the development of devices for the hospital environment. There are a number of different simulation labs that out there that really create a lot of tools and resources to use. For individual development projects, the clinical resources and contacts on the team can be really useful for recruiting users and connecting with key opinion leaders early in a project. And then there are other resources available for planning studies as well, like your market research groups who can help with user recruiting and reaching broad populations of users as well. So there are a lot of tools out there, and it's important to use a lot of different pieces of those networks and work together, because I think all of our objective is to make sure that the devices that are ultimately end up being used are safe and effective, and so we can work together to do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. And then any thoughts on contract concerns, timing with some of the hospitals, vendor versus others? So how do those contractual obligations or confidentiality work when you're working with a sim lab?
Yeah, so I think there are two questions there. One is the simulation lab that you're working with directly, or if you're working with someone who's providing a service to help you execute the study. That's a little bit easier to establish NDAs for confidentiality and things of that nature. When it comes to users, that's a little bit trickier. You can decide how extensive you want your confidentiality statements that each user reviews prior to a study to be. Some choose to make it much more legal language and pages of documents for the user to read. Some keep it a little bit more simple but less legally binding. So that's just a choice to make based on your product and sort of tolerance for that risk for the particular product under development.
Great. Thanks. Question from Monica Burke. Have you iteratively tied in the usability studies with the agile process for software development? I'm thinking examples might be in a GUI interface or some user interface where there's software involved. How do we typically do that within an interface for users that have software components in an agile type environment?
Yeah, I would say if you're using an agile software development process, that can actually be a great opportunity for integrating users. If you can think about sequencing your sprints to be to focus on certain features first or complete functionality first, that's also useful from a usability standpoint, then you can think about planning your studies to align with when you're going to have certain features within that process. So I think it can integrate quite well. And I think for an effective usability engineering program, it's really about having a good plan and thinking about how that plan integrates with the other development activities that are going on, and can really be customized to the individual development plan for that product.
Awesome. Another question from Tata. What are the thoughts on using feedback from technicians from cleaning and disinfection testing? So either part of the verification and validation process, for formative feedback on the instructions for cleaning and disinfection. So how do we tie that in for sterilization and things like that?
Yeah, I think that's great. If you have internal folks who are developing the cleaning and disinfection procedures and there's feedback, ideally you can just integrate that in their feedback into the design as part of the formative data that you've collected. And then it's important also that as part of your validation later that you do have people who are independent of those technicians that are part of your company also demonstrate that the cleaning and disinfection can be performed effectively.
Great.
So I think that, yes, that would absolutely be a great approach to collect that feedback.
Question on validating usability testing on invasive devices. So is the simulation still work for that?
Yes, I think in many cases, simulation can work. Again, it depends on the particular device and whether it can be realistically simulated. The objective of your human factors validation is to simulate real use conditions as closely as possible. So there are a lot of tools that you can use, like tissue analogs or simulator models that can adequately simulate the anatomy to be able to do that. or there might be other tools that you can use, like a cadaver lab to be integrated in with your usability process if you need something that's a little bit more realistic. Or in some cases, usability can be integrated in with actual use or your clinical program that's being executed. So it really depends on the device, but I think there are a lot of tools out there to effectively simulate use, and that's usually it's useful to simulate usability before you use it in actual use, because part of what you want to do in a human factors validation is be very hands-off, not help the user, let them make mistakes if they're going to make mistakes. And we certainly can't use quite that approach in an actual use scenario, because we don't want to cause harm to the patient.
Great. Going back up the list here, what human factors and usability data is required by the EU's notified bodies? So in order for CE marking or otherwise, is it drastically different from the FDA?
So within the EU, there is the expectation that you're following the usability engineering process, and that your usability engineering file will make up your part of your overall technical file. So you do want to still, regardless of if it's FDA or EU, you're still applying the usability engineering process and iterating along the way and doing a final human factors validation at the end of development. And important, thinking about where you're going for usability is also important. If you are going to have users in different international locations, medical practice can differ across those locations. So it's important to be thoughtful about, are my users in Europe different than my users in the US? And you may need to plan to make sure that you have users or evaluate things in facilities in Europe if you're going to Europe, if there are differences in those users that affect use. The FDA is pretty clear in their usability guidance that for US-based, that they would like to see US-based participants for those studies. Great.
Another question, are devices generally used while wearing uncomfortable personal protective equipment, e.g. lead or sterile gowns or face masks? However, our participants will likely balk at being asked to wear those in a usability test. What kind of arguments have been successful in convincing the FDA that this personal protective equipment would not affect the validity of a simulated use test?
Sure. Well, I think that evidence is always best. So a lot of times, if there are questions about methods that we're going to use and whether something impacts use, it's useful to evaluate that early informative evaluations. And if you can prove that really, there are no use differences, then maybe you have a good argument for why it doesn't impact use. But I would probably err on the other side of trying to figure out strategies to convince my users to wear the PPE during the test, because really, I do think that something like wearing gloves or something like that really can impact how they're able to use the device. So thinking about how we might convince them to help us and actually use that equipment during the study might be more of the route that I would take.
Agreed. And here's another question. How do you handle usability deviations during clinical trials?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, I think that during a clinical trial, sometimes you can integrate your usability process in with the clinical trial, but it needs to be designed carefully and, of course, protect subjects. So during a clinical trial, you certainly don't want to just let someone commit a use error, but that can still be categorized as a use difficulty or use error if they are about to commit a mistake or have a close call in the context of a clinical study.
Awesome. So I think that's it for questions. If anybody else has any questions they'd like to add, here's one more. From Alex, have you researched devices or interfaces that employ artificial intelligence or abstract decision making? Sometimes where the logic of the output might be black box to the end user. Examples, diagnostic tools, database tools, or team systems. I know it's one step removed from traditional medical devices, but what have we seen in that space?
Yeah, sure. I haven't personally worked on a usability program for an AI device. I know AI is something that is starting to become more and more used and have been integrated into some early development. But I think that the basic principles of the usability engineering process are the same. You know, test the user for what they're going to be doing and make sure that they can do it safely and effectively. So if they don't get to see any of the information, you know, what are the use steps that they are doing, and make sure that they can do those safely and effectively. Now, proving that whatever the AI or decision-making process is giving you good information, I think that's a little bit separate from usability, but I think something that I'm sure there will be a lot of scrutiny on in the future.
Excellent. Okay, well, we're right on the hour right now. I just want to thank Katie for the presentation. That was great, and thanks for answering all these questions. If you have any other follow-up questions, you can reach Katie at kmchugh@mpr.com. But any closing thoughts, Katie?
Just again, think about usability as a risk, and think about driving that risk down early, thinking about the overall risk from a systems perspective. And again, as Jeff mentioned, I do welcome you to reach out to me directly if you have any further questions. Thank you very much, everyone.
Excellent. And thanks, Rachel and Brian, for hosting today, and to MassMedic as a partner. This has been great. And we look forward to any other questions or interactions online. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.